In this video, I'm going to explain my Fujifilm custom JPEG settings for my X100V, why I use them, as well as providing some sample images for you guys to be able to look at. Before this video starts, I just want to say please subscribe. Only about 10% of people that watch my videos actually are subscribed, so please just do me a quick favor and go ahead and hit that subscribe button. So when it comes to actually shooting with the X100V and using my custom JPEG settings, they're constantly changing. And that's because based on the different scenes and the lighting conditions and different things like that, I'm constantly adjusting and changing different things in camera to get the best image possible. And I did mention in my X100V video that I'm trying to shoot everything straight out of camera, but sometimes there are going to be instances where you're going to want to adjust things in something like Lightroom. So you're not going to be able to get something straight out of camera every single time. So my first custom setting is the exact same as my X100S. I mentioned in my previous videos that I'm still going to use the exact same film simulation and all the same settings that I used on my X100S, but on the X100V in order to be able to use my same exact preset that I use in Lightroom. So just to go over it again, my settings for that are using the film simulation ProNeg high, everything else is set to off, and then I have the tone curve at -2 highlights and -1 shadows. And then I also have the noise reduction at -2. And everything else, again, is on auto or at 0. So that's that. I mean, I don't really use this film simulation or custom setting for straight out of camera. This is more for my very specific preset from Lightroom, so that I can go in and actually edit this. I haven't really been using this actually, so I'm not going to provide any images, but I wanted to include this just so that you guys know all 7 of the custom settings on my camera. So my next 4 custom settings are all kind of variations of roughly the same thing. I have very slight tweaks on each of these just so that it's a lot easier to switch to a different custom setting if a different scene or situation happens where I want just a very slight variation and I don't want to go in and change a bunch of different things. So for all of these, I use the Film Simulation Classic Chrome. To me, this has just been the best film simulation and part of the reason why I wanted to upgrade to the X100V. I knew that using this film simulation was going to be the most closely to what I'm wanting my images to look like, and they definitely do. But when I'm using this film simulation, I've noticed that there are definitely some variations when it comes to different lighting and things, and there are slight things that I'm wanting to constantly change. So I'm just gonna go over each of the different settings rather than explaining each of my individual custom settings, because it's just going to make a lot more sense when you know exactly why I use settings and why I don't use settings, so that you really kind of understand in different situations why I would use specific things, because these 4 custom settings are constantly changing. I really don't have them set to anything specific. I just have like some of them will be -1 shadows versus one will be +1 shadows. It just small variations like that. So to start with grain, I usually have this set to small, weak, or to off. I do like grain in my photos, but I have been noticing that I don't particularly like the grain in camera with Fujifilm, but the weak small has been the best in my opinion. I was using strong small for a while, and I just kind of thought that it was a little bit overpowering, so I've dialed that back and now I'm using weak strong. Otherwise, I just leave this setting off because I know that I can add it in Lightroom later if I'm wanting it. And at high ISO, it adds some extra noise anyway, so there's no real need for grain. The next setting is the color chrome effect, and I have this set to weak. I used to have it set to strong, but recently I've kind of dialed it back a little bit and have it on weak now. And basically what this setting does is it takes the majority of the saturated colors besides blue, and it kind of brings down the luminance but still adds a little bit of saturation. It's kind of weird what the effect does. You just kind of have to test it out to see for yourself exactly what it's going to look like on your images. But I have this set to weak now rather than strong, and that's been working great for me. Next is color chrome effect blue, and obviously that is the exact same thing as the color chrome effect, but it only affects the blues. And I personally don't care for blue in my photos. Like, at all. So I have this set to off so that it really doesn't increase any of the blues. The next setting is white balance. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important setting if you're wanting to shoot things straight out of camera. And it can be one of the trickiest things to really kind of understand and get a feel for. So when it comes to white balance, you're just going to have to kind of base things off of what you're seeing in camera as well as what you're seeing in post-processing. So you might think that you like what you're seeing straight out of camera, but then you look at it on a bigger screen and you're like, wow, I actually don't really care for this. So it's something that you're really going to have to play with and find exactly what you're liking. So when I'm using my white balance settings, at first I was using daylight and trying to use that outside, and I didn't really care for it. And I've tried to use all the default settings with shade and whatnot, but I think that auto tends to kind of get exactly where I want it to be. And so I use auto, but then I add a little bit of different colors in depending on what I'm liking. So typically what I'll do is I'll add red and subtract blue. So I'll do anything from plus red 2 and minus 3 blue, or plus 6 red and minus 7 blue. It's really anywhere in between there. There's definitely some variations. It's going to depend on the lighting and everything. But if you're liking warm photos, this is definitely the way to go in my opinion, which is to use the auto white balance and then just adding a little bit of warmth to it. But when it comes to that, I think that most often I find myself doing plus 3 red and negative 5 blue. So dynamic range is something that really kind of varies, and it's going to depend on the images that you're wanting to create. If you're wanting more of a flatter image, you're going to want to use dynamic range 400. And if you're somebody that likes a little bit more contrast, your probably best bet is to use auto. So for me, I have both of them in each of my individual custom settings. So some of my custom settings I have set to auto, and some of them I have set to 400. It really kind of depends on the look that I'm going for, but typically I have been liking dynamic range 400, and it's really flattened out the image a lot more and made it a little bit more film-like because it brings down those highlights so much. Tone curve is something that I kind of change up quite a bit, like I mentioned before, but the majority of the time I have it set to -2 highlights and -1 shadows. I personally prefer to have my shadows raised a little bit and then decreasing the highlights as much as possible. So that's why I go with these settings. But there could be a scene where I raise the shadows even more and go to -2 shadows, or I might add shadows even. It's really just going to depend from scene to scene. But like I said, typically -2 highlights, -1 shadows. Again, like I said, things are definitely going to vary. And when it comes to color, this is no different. For classic chrome, this is already a fairly desaturated film simulation to begin with. So I tend to use a little bit more color. On some of my settings, I use +2, and then other ones I even use -1. So it's anywhere kind of in between. I find myself using +1 probably the most. Sharpness I have set to 0. I personally don't like to over sharpen my images, and I feel like my Tiffin Black Pro Mist filter already kind of softens up the image quite a bit already. So there's really no reason to decrease it. But if I'm not using this filter, I might bring the sharpness down to -1 or -2. Noise reduction, I always have set to -2. I really don't see a ton of difference in this besides using really high ISO, but I typically try not to use above 3200 anyways. So -2 has just been what I've been using ever since the X100S. And lastly, with clarity, I just have this set to 0 because it slows the camera down and it's just not something that I really use in my images. I would maybe decrease it, but to me it's just not even necessary because it slows down the camera. So again, with all of these 4 custom settings, they really kind of vary from scene to scene, but I always use the Film Simulation Classic Chrome, and I always use Auto White Balance and then add some warmth. But maybe you can try some of these settings out for yourself, and hopefully you like the images that you're making just as much as I do. My 6th custom setting is more of my experimental one right now. I've been using the classic negative right now, and honestly, I don't really care for it. I think that it adds a little bit too much green to the image, and it's just not something that I'm interested in. I'll provide a few examples of shots that I've taken with it, but it just really hasn't been one of my favorite film simulations so far. I think that the next one that I'm probably going to try to test out a little bit more is Astia, but this might just become another slot for classic chrome. Lastly, I use the Film Simulation Acros for my black and white settings. I personally don't shoot a whole ton of black and white, but when I do, I use the Film Simulation Acros. And typically I still use pretty much the same settings that I do for almost everything else, which is -2 highlights and -1 shadows. But I have been bringing the shadows back a little bit, so I've been using 0 or +1. Really just kind of depends on the scene that I'm shooting. I know there are a ton of other film simulation recipes for black and white specifically, so mine probably is not the best one to go with for that. So those are all of my custom settings straight out of camera. I hope that maybe you guys were able to learn something and maybe you'll try some of these settings out for yourself. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment down below. But with all that being said, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday.